Everyone. Thanks Jaime and Jorge to make possible this webinar. And yeah, we're gonna start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adriana. Thank you for having us and for giving us the opportunity to be here in this webinar. Well, the idea of this webinar, which has this very fancy name, The Changing Landscape of Competitive Football, is for Jorge and myself to give you a bit of an overview of basically the last, let's say, or most relevant topics in the world of football, how things are changing, and allow you obviously to ask any questions that you might consider necessary. So basically, I know, Jorge, if you want me to go forward or if you want to say any introductory words.
No, I think it's exactly what you mentioned, Jaime, so I think we can kick off.
Perfect. So the idea first is to start explaining the basics, right? At least here in Europe, we have a European sport model that is based on several principles, let's say. And it is very important to understand this, especially if we're going to focus, for example, in the example of the Super League, of the European Super League, right? So in order to understand how this is changing the landscape of competitive football, we need to understand the European sport model, which is very, very briefly based on a pyramidal structure where you have international federations at the top, followed by the national federations, and then at the very bottom of the pyramid, you have the clubs and the players and the athletes. This applies to all sports, not just football. Then another of the principles of this sports model is the principle of promotion and relegation. Basically, clubs, according to sporting merit, will stay at the higher leagues, or they will relegate also based on sporting demerit, if we can say it like this, which, as you all might know, it's one of the most different things compared to the American or the North American model of sport. Another characteristic of the European sport model is the promotion of grassroots and also this compromise with the national identity of competitions. So what we know today as the Premier League, La Liga, and all the other major leagues, or all the other leagues at national level that exist right now. So if we focus on the example of the European Super League, and on my side, this is I'm not taking sides, I'm not giving an opinion, I'm just exposing the issue and as it is right now, and I'm trying to be as objective as I can. The creation of the Super League unavoidably leads to a clash between one of the pillars of this European super model and of the European Union in itself, which is the defense of free competition between companies. And on the other side, you have the European model of sport, which has also been called and understood as the specificity of sport. This is the terminology that has been used by the European Union. So there is such a clash. Why? Well, legally speaking, because one of the consequences of creating the Super League is that on the one hand side, it tries to enhance competition according to those that have tried to create a Super League, but at the same time, it leaves the structure of the European model. Okay, it's a competition that would be outside of UEFA's competence. And on the other side of that, or at the same time, the project at the very beginning, at least, because now it seems to have changed, but it ignored the principles of promotion and relegation that I just mentioned, because the initial idea was that with 15 clubs, a closed list of 15 clubs would compete every year against each other, regardless of how well or how bad they were doing on sporting wise. And then obviously on a more political level, because for UEFA, 15 of the top clubs of Europe would leave their own competition, the Champions League, this would devalue such competition, and this would have relevant financial consequences on UEFA. So this would be the introduction to the European model of sport. And now, Jorge, I give you the floor to explain the governance of sports in Europe.
Thank you very much, Jaime. I think this introduction that you gave, it's particularly relevant for our audience, as we have people from the US to Jordan, to the other side of the world as well. And probably things that for us, we both come from Spain, are quite basic, and we understand them since we're very young, because we've always been, we were raised with this model since we were very young, as just kids that enjoyed football, played football, and now we work both in football. It's not the same everywhere. So I think it's really important, this introduction that you've given, because things that you mentioned are not like this in other places of the world, particularly in the US, as it's very well known, that their sports model, it's very, very different. In terms of governance, it's important to highlight that football in particular, but sports in general, in Europe, they are channeled through the association model. So, of course, every country, people play different kind of sports, that's clear. But the sports federations are the bodies responsible to manage, administer, and develop those sports in their respective territory. This is particularly relevant because the topic that you just mentioned, the Super League, it has, or it brings different elements to the table. You mentioned some legal ones, which of course are there, but there are other elements which are as important as the legal one, like the governance model, financial elements, and even the purpose of football or sports in general in our current societies. I think that when we speak about the governance model, it's also important to highlight that we have the football pyramid or the sports pyramid, which geographically it's quite clear to understand. So coming from the top in Europe, that would be UEFA as the confederation which administers and manages football in Europe. Underneath UEFA, you have the federations, national associations, which manage and administer football in their own territory. And then below that, it's also quite interesting to see how it differs from place to place. On some of the bigger federations, in terms of geographically speaking, you would normally have regional associations that manage football in those in that territory. In other ones, you'd have directly leagues or even clubs in some of the smaller federations. But it's important to see the connection between the top, which would be UEFA, and the bottom, which would be the smaller club in the smaller region of the smaller country in Europe. And all of this is connected based on the football pyramid. So today, one of the things we're going to speak about is this the challenges or the changes that we're seeing in competitive football. The Super League, it's definitely one of them. There are more. And I think it's quite interesting to see the different angles. You spoke a bit about the legal one, Jaime. Maybe you want to develop a bit on that angle. But we definitely should also discuss why now, why the clubs that were involved and not others, and what's going to be the next steps on this project.
Absolutely. I mean, I fully agree. And I think that, as you say, there are many risks. It's not necessarily just the Super League, but there are other ways of entertainment that nowadays are attracting the, let's say, more classical audience that was watching and following sport. And I mean, the reality is that sport has become a business. It's been a long time since it left, let's say, the initial amateur status of the sport and so on, and it has become a real business where huge amounts of money are being invested every year and by very different stakeholders with different interests. So on the one hand side, this means that there is a need to also protect, let's say, the integrity and the basic principles of football, at least in my opinion. But at the same time, in order for the sport, and if we're talking about football, for football to still be competitive as a business and to still be attractive for, well, the general public, like all of you that are watching, like ourselves, then we must also be able to, you know, adapt and be able to, well, provide the tools so that the sport and football can still continue to be competitive. And when I say competitive, I mean with respect to, well, it's not just the classical model of sport competitions that we have here in Europe, like we would see with the Champions League and with the national leagues and with the national cups, but also, well, things like esports, for instance. Now this Kings League that was played last year, for instance, that attracted a lot of attention. So these are different ways of entertainment that might be taking, you know, the attention away from football. And if this is really the situation, then this could lead to a serious issue. So I think in that sense, well, everyone that wants to be involved in sport is now being required to be very well prepared. Again, this is more now a business than anything else. So as with any other business, you know, and as following the European sport model, the merit of each person and the expertise of each person is essential. And we're not talking about just running a sport for the sake of running a sport. We're now also talking about running a sport in order to attract the attention of the spectators, to help that sport grow. And normally, and if we follow the European sport model, then this, if the sport is growing, this means that there is a benefit also, not just for, let's say, the top leagues and the top clubs, but because of the solidarity mechanisms in place and so on, there will also be a positive repercussion to grassroots football and finally to society in general.
I think, Jaime, from what you mentioned, there are a couple of elements that I would like to highlight. And one of them is that of those threats that you spoke about, Kings League, alternative ways of entertainment, that all of them are there. I think it's particularly relevant to think that our way of structuring football has not changed much over the last 100 years in terms of the competitions, mainly. The system of the leagues, for example, in Europe, it's pretty much the same today as it was 100 years ago. It has not really evolved. In terms of the cups, that's a bit different from country to country. There are a bit of different formats. In our case, we tried to innovate with the Super Cup, changing a little bit the format, and what I think it was a good decision, and some countries are now following. I think the last one was Italy. We're also going to do a final for the Super Cup. But it's very interesting for me to see how the world is changing, how we are aware of all the threats that are affecting and will affect competitive football, and there's still little innovation in some aspects in terms of competitions, especially at domestic level. Linking this to the Super League, I think it's also important to ask the right questions, you know, because at the end, we know, and it's known, that for many years big clubs have tried to get more control with regards to UEFA, which is not really anything different to what normally happens in domestic leagues everywhere. You can go to any country in Europe that I know, probably around the world as well, and probably the big clubs will be the ones that will try to have more influence within the federation. So that part, it's quite common. Again, balance is the key, because at the end of the day, the clubs, which again, it's normal, they tend to look for their own benefit. However, there need to be these organizations that think about the common good and how the decisions that they take will impact the entire ecosystem, not just the big clubs. And if it's not the national associations and confederations at continental level, it's very hard for anybody else to have that global mindset. At the end of the day, there can't be big clubs if there are no smaller clubs, if there are no kids that play in their own neighborhoods, in the local clubs that go up the ranks. So that's why it's very, very important to keep that balance right. And sometimes the biggest of the biggest clubs don't necessarily think about that. And by projects like this, the Super League have a direct impact on the entire current ecosystem. And it's important to approach this threat or this situation from the different angles, as we mentioned, because most of the times you see on the media, oh, it's Super League, and only think about the number of games, the money from TV. But what about everything else? What about all the money that's going today for smaller clubs within those big leagues, but also clubs from medium leagues around Europe, etc., etc., etc. That's why there's another element that I wanted to link, and I think it's something that it's going to be key in the next years, which is data. Data, it's basic in order to take decisions everywhere. When we organized the strategy of the Spanish FA, it was a fundamental aspect when we were doing the SWOT analysis. In order to take good decisions, we need to have good data. And over these couple of years, since the Super League was announced, you've been hearing data from here to there, but not very accurate. And I think this is going to be something also super important for the next years, to be able to have the right data for how sports is being consumed, who is consuming it, what the audience and the people and the fans want. And that will help the governing bodies to take decisions in order of how to improve the current competitions model.
Absolutely. And I think it's also, I mean, I know the seminar or the webinar today is about football, but I mean, it's also important, I think, to take a broader, let's say, a broader scope and also look at other sports, because this is something that, you know, is transversal to other sports. I don't think it's necessarily relevant or important to just focus on this is a European model, it can never be changed, or it can never be amended, or it can never evolve. I think it's also interesting to understand and know, for example, the US model or the American model, to also see and have, you know, the tools to be able to decide which one has the best, well, or which characteristics of each model is better, to understand why each one is as it is. So I think that's also enriching to understand both sides of, let's say, of the two main models that we have in the world, and also understand what happens in other sports, because at the end, what happens in other competitions, in other sports, might help to find solutions for different, you know, for football or any other sport. So I think that's also something that is interesting for anyone being involved in sports in general, or in football in particular, to have a wider view of what's going on in the sports business or in the sports landscape.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could not agree more. And in my case, that I'm focused in football at the moment, of course, it's particularly interesting because at the end, seeing what all the federations do, other sports do, how they develop the different sports around the world, it's really interesting. We are very lucky in Spain in terms of the Spanish FA that football is the #1 sport in the country. But still, even this being the case, one of the things that we identified as an issue in Spain is that there's a lot of people that play football outside the umbrella of the Spanish FA. So even in our case, there are things that we need to learn and to improve. And definitely this thing that you mentioned, Jaime, checking what other sports do, how the different models are, it's a very, very important aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, for instance, the organization of events, something as as simple as that, which we take for granted. We see that there's a Champions League, we see that there is a World Cup, we see that there's the NBA, but what happens behind the scenes, what is being done by the different people and organizations running those sports to make those events happen. Things like this, I think, are also topics that many people involved in sport do not necessarily know exactly what's going on, and having an understanding of things like this, or having an understanding of why marketing in sports is so essential, and why how social media is also disrupting a bit the way that football has been evolving, or sports, or the impact that this has over the sport itself. Because, well, we see a lot of comments in social media against players. Now we have seen campaigns lately from UEFA, from FIA in motorsports about, well, trying to fight these messages of hatred and so on in social media. So there are many elements surrounding the sport that we might consider like secondary or not as important, but that are very important, in my opinion. They are essential for a proper understanding of how sports are being developed and how sports are being run. And anyone wanting to be involved in, I think, in sports should have at least a minimal understanding of these things.
I think, Jaime, what you just said, I think it's the right moment to link it with the Masters in International Sports Management. That it's the second part of the webinar. We have Adriana with us, so I'll give you the floor in a minute, Adri, but just wanted to follow up on your comments. In these last minutes, we've spoken about very different topics within sports, different angles: sports, law, governance, finance, impact, the impact that it has in the society, data, technology. So there are a lot of elements that need to be taken into account once you are facing and you are addressing the changing landscape of competitive football, in my case specifically, sports in general. And probably one of the best tools that you may have in order to be educated in these topics and gain knowledge in all of these topics, it's through a master like the one that Adriana is going to introduce to you now.
So thank you, Jorge and Jaime. I think everything that you have explained is really interesting. And this is the reason why you are the directors of this program, because your expertise is amazing. And I think that when you were designing and creating the program, it's a very different program from the rest of the Masters in International Sports Management, because it's like in 4 months, we touch 10 different modules that I think Jaime and Jorge will explain later on. But yeah, it's a master of 4 months, powered by the Spanish Football Royal Federation with these 2 amazing directors. This program also includes the possibility to spend 1 weekend in London, where the students will be able to visit Premier League, Tottenham, Professional Football Association, with master classes by the top teachers that are the leaders of these organizations. Also, the quality of the teachers in the master, it's the same. Like, we will have the head of marketing of the best clubs in Europe, people from Nike, people from FIFA, UEFA, Jaime and Jorge as well. So we will have the most important people of this sector teaching you in a practical way. And also, after this 4 months, you will have the possibility to do internships. The internships in this case, it's a strong point of this program, because from the federation, from Jaime, from ITI, we have a very, very big networking. So these is an important point, because if you don't have this networking in the sports world, it's very difficult to get in the industry. So when you touch the right bottoms or the right points, you can do it. So it's important that you have in mind that with this program, you will know all the more relevant people in this sector, that they will help you to get in the industry. So from my side, it's everything. Jaime, Jorge, I think you have some questions. If you want to answer these questions, and if you want to add some points at my explanation.
Well, I think the explanation was very good. I think, as Adriana mentioned, when drawing up the program, we try to cover all the different topics that are important for us, for anyone that wants to, well, be involved in sports management more specifically. So basically, we analyze the organization and governance in sports, the regulatory framework. There's a module on management and strategy. There's one obviously on marketing, which is essential for sports, on how events are organized and different models around the world. There's communication, there's also a bit of finance and taxation, which for some people is not so appealing, but it's also very important to understand when you're working in any business, but also in sport. And obviously each module is focused on sport. It's not just a general module on communication or marketing or finance, but it's very specific and focused on sports. And well, overall, we try to gather the correct professionals and the main topics that allow anyone that is involved in sports, to have a broad view of what's out there, and also identify maybe potential career options, either to continue them or to start them if that's what you're looking. So I think it gives tools for different profiles also.
Jaime, I would like to add on what you mentioned on top of the content that I agree that we've covered the different angles that are essential for anybody who wants to work in sports to be aware of and to be able to know how those different elements impact decision-making in sports. There is one of the modules which is focused on professional skills that I think it would be particularly relevant to the students, because at the end of the day, the knowledge, of course, it's very important. It's basic, probably it's the main aspect. But at the end of the day, once you go to the real world, it's very important to also be equipped with the right tools in order to be successful at job interviews, in order to develop further in your career, to have successful negotiations. And I think this module will bring a lot of potential to the table, on top of the final projects, which will not just be internships, which is an option, but also like consultancy projects with the organizations that where the teachers come from. So one of the key elements of the program is that every teacher that will be part of it will either offer internships or the possibility of conducting these consultancy projects in their respective organizations. And this will definitely be a very, very important project opportunity for all the students of the program.
Thank you so much. Jaime and Jorge, do you see that we have 2 questions? I don't know if you can see it in preguntas y respuestas. If you want to answer these questions, I don't know who wants to start.
Sure. Okay, I'll start with the Kings League. Well, the Kings League, it's been a phenomenon in Spain. It's obvious. It's been everywhere around the news, even casual conversations. And I personally think it's a great example of how to innovate. I think the Kings League has realized some of the threats that we mentioned before about alternative ways of entertainment, the role of technology in our current day-to-day. They've created a product which is definitely entertaining, and the fact that they managed to attract, as the person asks or mentions, 90,000 people for over 7 hours in one day, it's impressive. I think that governing bodies need to rethink what we're doing. Elite competitions need to rethink what they're doing as well, because this is it's showing really how or where the way is. If you look at the tendency of the Spanish league games, which are the ones that I know the most, and in a lot of cases don't even reach 66%, 60% of the stadiums. And then you have the figure that we have here of a full Camp Nou for over 7 hours on a Sunday. It definitely forces you to ask yourself some questions. So I think that this should be a phenomenon that we need to address, that we need to study, to learn from, and definitely see how or which of these elements we can apply into our current competitions and day to day of how we function.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I'll take the second question that I see here, which is what exactly are your day-to-day duties and work in your roles, and how can others work in similar roles, and whether a master in sports management will help and if it's required. Well, I read it just in case for those watching, maybe if you don't have access to the Q&A, then I read it and then you know why I'm saying what I'm saying. On my side, personally speaking, my role, well, I'm a lawyer, so my role is mainly linked to giving legal advice to different stakeholders in the world of football. So I speak and I have clients, we have international federations at the law firm, we have clubs, athletes, different type of stakeholders, so companies that are involved in business around sports and things like this. So it's quite varied. Everything is linked to sports from our side because we are specialized in sports and we know the ecosystem and the business overall. Whether a sports management is helpful to achieve this type of position, well, I think, as I mentioned before, that understanding how sports are organized, understanding the different elements of sports is essential for anyone that wants to work in sport. So obviously this is your fast track to understand the different elements that there are surrounding sport. And for example, in the master, how we have planned it, there is a module specifically on legal. There's one on governance, but there's also marketing, and there's also events, and there's also communication. And as Jorge mentioned, there are professional skills. So I think that, yeah, a master in sports management will give you that broader picture. If you're a lawyer, if you're, I don't know, specialized in marketing, if you're, I don't know, whatever role you might have, it's always important to understand, you know, the overall system in order to not just identify, well, the risks and the characteristics of each sport and of each model, and allow you to have those tools to see what can be improved and what you can give to the company where you're working at, or to create your own company, but maybe also to understand, well, maybe I want to change my career. Maybe I want, you know, to go into this type of work, which I found extremely interesting in the master and which I had no clue about. So the use of the master is good to access the sports business, but it's also good to navigate through the sports business.
Amazing.
And following up on this and answering the second question, which I would very quick of the duties of the role. At the end, I'm director of 2 departments at the Spanish FA, Strategy and International Relations. And in both of them, I need to be aware of very different aspects. A lot of the ones that we've discussed today, legal, governance, finance, etc. So I firmly believe that for anybody who studies these masters, it will bring a lot of opportunities to develop their career in a very similar way to what Jaime said, either starting in a new role or developing further through the same organization, a new organization, as it will give you more tools and knowledge to be able to address the problems with a different mindset. And this is one of the reasons why I think that for all of you who end up studying this course will be very beneficial. And there is a second aspect, which is not just about the knowledge, which will be the networking. I myself did a program years ago, and it's a fantastic way to get to know people with a similar mindset that you have, that are also passionate about sports and want to pursue careers in this field, and not just within students, but with also all the teachers that we mentioned that will come from top organizations, will allow all of you to build a very strong network that will be beneficial for you, not just in these first years, but throughout your entire career.
And I think that's actually, there's a third question that just came in. How is this master different from an official master's degree from a university? Well, precisely what Jorge already said, like the network, the professors, the fact that this is an extremely pragmatic and practical, let's say, master. It's designed to give you not just the knowledge, but also a pragmatic and the real visibility and a real experience on how sports is managed, and all the different modules of the master will be very pragmatic and very practical for everyone, which is already something that we can see in some more traditional, let's say, masters. You have more theoretical classes, while here we want to be a bit more dynamic in that sense. So that, together with the fact that you have top guys, the top people from all over the sports business, for each of the specific topics that we have identified for the program, I think that will be an essential difference from the other more traditional courses or masters that you will find out there.
Perfecto. So I don't know if there are more questions. Did you answer the last one? Yeah. Okay. So I think we have finished with this question. I don't know if someone else has more questions. Hello, dear Ahmed, else, how are you? Okay, just 1 second. I don't know if they have more questions or not, or it's just like a hi. So, Jaime.
I think it seems like a hi, and that has enjoyed the webinar.
Yeah, I think so too. So thank you so much, all the attendees, the co-directors of the program, for making it possible. We will be sending this webinar recorded today or tomorrow, okay? So everyone could see and could listen to these amazing professionals. And yeah, thank you again, and hope to see you soon, everyone, next year in the master. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.